Well, welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. And this is our second live Afternoon Light. And today I'm joined by Robert Menzies Institute board member and expert in United States politics, Professor Tim Lynch. Welcome, Tim. It's been an extremely busy time for you. On a 4-year cycle, this is really the busiest time of year for a US politics expert. But great to have you here to discuss the US presidential outcome, the resounding yes to Trump and his MAGA movement.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, interrogated by you, Georgina, in the great library of the Robert Menzies Institute.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. And to our audience today, this is a webinar, so you can see us, we can't see you, and your mics and cameras are all off. So wherever you're watching this, you can sit back, relax and enjoy this show. But I do encourage you to ask questions. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function. Type your questions in and I'll get them one way or another. The first 30 minutes of this 1 hour live podcast, Tim and I will have our discussion about the election and all things US politics and also some Menzies history. And then the second 30 minutes, we will take your questions. So we already have lots of questions that you've sent in. Thank you so much. But please keep using that Q&A function to ask away. So Tim, last week's result, was it a surprise or was it just as you thought?
Well, I would like to claim prescience here, but I don't really deserve that. Perhaps I'm a victim of the legacy media and campus politics where I spend much of my time, but I thought it was going to be tighter. I argued in a piece in the Australian that possibly we'd underestimated Kamala Harris's strengths, or certainly we needed to explain why so much of the Democratic Party so quickly was so invested in her success. And that turned out to be wrong. I don't think I got it as wrong as others like Rory Stewart, who said she'd win by a mile. But I thought it would be much closer and that the 7 swing states would be shared by both candidates. Trump's win is a remarkable one that gives him a democratic legitimacy, a mandate he didn't have 8 years ago. And he's certainly stronger than the administration he replaces. So it's an extraordinary result. And I don't think many of us saw it coming to quite the extent that it did.
So a few questions on that, Tim. When you look at US presidential election results, I think Trump's over 300 electoral college points now to Harris is about 220. So
yes.
Is that a very definitive result? Or, I mean, it's a funny system too, because it's a lot of winner takes all, isn't it?
Yes, it's not the 269, and there was a plausible scenario in which they would share the electoral college votes, but it's a comfortable victory. It puts him where George Bush was, the last Republican president. It puts him where Joe Biden was in 2020. It's a comfortable win in the Electoral College, but those who thought Trump had a good chance always expected the Electoral College to move in his direction. It structurally favors the Republicans. The remarkable thing is the fact that he wins the popular vote. I mean, I've spent the last several years saying Trump has a 47% ceiling. In the 4 elections we had where Trump was the candidate, that's 18 midterms, 20 general, 22 midterms. He never breaks the 47 ceiling. So I thought, well, if there is any sort of logic, if there's a pattern here, it's that one. And he blasted through it.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
So you're a professor of US politics. Pollsters across America, they're media pollsters, they're professional pollsters, they're party pollsters. I mean, the public polls, at least, were all pointing to Harris really by the end winning. So you're getting it wrong. Rory Stewart, he's a British political commentator these days, but he's getting it wrong. The pollsters are getting it wrong. Why do we keep seeing experts get Trump wrong?
Oh, well, I think it's illustrative, emblematic of a wider disconnect between experts and the MAGA movement or Trump supporters. Perhaps this is a long bow to draw, but let me suggest that part of the problem with how we've polled, how US pollsters have gone about assessing support for both sides, is that those on the left, the progressives, are much keener to answer those telephone calls or online surveys. And it seems clear, even allowing for this and all their clever algorithms, Trump supporters tend not to be as responsive. Doesn't mean they're secretive or ashamed of voting Trump. It does mean they're harder to reach. If they're harder to reach, they're harder to gauge the intentions of. The other thing I think connected to that is there wasn't a high degree of confidence about what the turnout would be. It used to be for most of US elections in our lifetime, high turnout indicated Democratic support. Whereas what put the fear of God into Democrats this time was high turnout would mean Trump. And the pollsters weren't good at allaying those fears. And I think those fears were realized last week.
Something you shared on your LinkedIn today, I think it was how the biggest swings to Trump were actually in the hardcore Democrat states. So the biggest swing in the country was in California, and then the second biggest swing was in New York, the state of New York.
It is, and for those that are lean conservative on these questions, I think it's important not to gloat, but I think it's worth observing that where Kamala Harris was best known, she did the worst. So in California, which was where she was schooled and raised in the progressive bosom of Democratic politics, saw the biggest swing towards Trump. New York, only second to California in terms of its Democratic hold, and yet huge swing red away from her. It's impossible to ignore, I think, the weakness of the candidate the Democrats put up, and we can interrogate those weaknesses, and I think it's probably appropriate to do so, but also measure that against the fact of Donald Trump and any Democrat up against him in this particular election, with immigration at an absurd level, with inflation having run at 20% for most of the Biden term. Any Democrat that was put up would have got the shellacking that Kamala Harris got. I think Kamala Harris and the wider Democratic establishment carry a lot of the blame, but I think there's also some structural reasons that a Democratic superwoman, which again that wouldn't have been able to change.
So you argued, I think, early on that Harris should have been the Democratic nominee. I mean, it sounds like you would. You'd step back from that assessment.
I think that's an important question, that, Georgina. I thought she was an inevitable nominee if Biden stepped aside. The point of nominating, and this works for every president, and they have all been he's, and look set to be so for a little while longer, they pick their running mate on the basis of their ability to replace them. So that it was very hard for Biden to say, well, I only picked her to win African-American votes in South Carolina. I only picked her because she was a DEI hire. If you pick someone as vice president, what you're actually doing is anointing them to replace you, whether you're assassinated or whether you resign, or indeed whether you leave and allow her to run in full. So it was never tenable to me that the Democrats, in whatever time frame, but certainly not in the one they allowed for, could find a candidate that could command a Democratic consensus and not be her. So they were saddled with her and had to make a virtue of it because of his choice back in early 2020.
But they could have. They would have been recognising President Biden's mental decline, despite the fact they were saying it wasn't there. He was fine, but those close to him would have been observing that, and there was an opportunity to run a race against him. Or do you think it was always too difficult because he's the incumbent?
I don't think it's tenable. Yeah, so many dominoes have got to fall. If Biden insisted on hanging on as long as he did, and Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, who held their noses and got on with it until it became untenable to do so, they carry a huge burden here for creating a scenario where in a campaign where the Democrat had to be the strongest they could possibly be, they ended up in a situation where where a compromised candidate was running against Trump.
So, Tim, you thought that Harris was the inevitable pick, and she was, despite being a bad candidate and having been proved to be a bad candidate when she ran against Biden in the Democratic primary. On Vance, you criticised Vance as Trump's running mate. You know, I mean, he was obviously a success. He was popular with younger male voters, and he is,
Yes.
I mean, in your latest column, you're saying he is actually the future of the Republican
Yes.
Party. I mean, Trump's now never going to run again, and after a couple of years, he'll be a lame duck president. So Vance is it. And you were in your column, The Age of Trump, you were praising
Yes,
Vance.
well,
So you've had another about face there.
Despite claiming to be
about facing everywhere, really.
well, I think it's a sign of wisdom to admit when you get it wrong.
Yeah.
And I've become very wise. Yes, I think the initial instinct I had, and wasn't alone in this, that when the picks were made of the VP, Harris seemed to be covering more of the bases than Trump did, and in this sense that she picked Tim Walz, the guy who I predict will fade pretty quickly from the scene. Remarkably, she managed to pick somebody that was worse than her on the campaign trail. Extraordinary achievement. But he represented, at least on paper, a kind of sop to red voters. He'd won when he was in the House in Minnesota. He'd won a few red-leaning districts, neighborhoods even, not even districts. And this suggested, well, she's making a play for the middle. She's going to now try and win over the Trump skeptical on the right side of politics. And it turned out that in some ways he represented more of filled out this woke caricature that the GOP were very good at painting, possibly more than she did. So there was a piece by Walter Russell Mead in which he points out his policy on trans rights and the priority he gave to this over the much, I think on paper at least, measured statistically, the much more severe crisis of fentanyl suicide, of overdose. He was painted into a woke corner. Whereas Vance, I think, my first concern was the opposite, that Vance represented overreach on Trump's part, that he was picking someone, he could pick anyone, he was saying. I just happen to like this guy this week. And I mean, it's such a powerful position, the VP choice doesn't matter. But what I think has actually turned out to be the case is that Vance, despite efforts to paint him as weird and as single childless cat ladies, actually represents a much more intellectual framing of the MAGA movement.
And he's actually a champion of cats.
Yes,
dogs.
I think
so, maybe he was on the side.
That always wins me over if someone is a cat person. So he was never anti-cat. And I think Democrats weren't able to demonize him in the way that Republicans were able to demonize Tim Walz. And that accounts, I think, for their success and failure.
So one of the really interesting trends in this election, and I think potentially we're seeing this unfold in Australia and in the Anglosphere in the UK as well, is the right of politics is reorienting itself to being the party of the working class.
Yes,
and Trump seems to have done that. I mean, how are these political realignments taking place? And I mean, do we see precedents for these in history, in American history, which
yes.
of course you would be more familiar with, but there's also, I wonder if there are precedents in Australian history too.
Well, there's a couple of responses there. I think that alignments, if you're a political scientist, you'd probably identify at least five. The last one in 1968, when the Democrats stopped representing the party of segregation and of the South, and started to turn towards or affirmed itself as the party of civil rights and of African Americans. And the Republicans at that stage through the 1970s started to absorb the Southern Democrats that were unhappy in this reformulated Democratic Party. I think, and there is some debate over whether we're seeing a comparable realignment now, but my pitch would be probably yes, that what we're seeing now is an affirmation that the Democrats failed because they stopped speaking for the working class. I mean, this was their raison d'etre from the very beginning. They're an older party than the Republicans, and their explicit rationale was the representation of the workers, of the lower middle class. And they lost the knack of doing that, or they deprioritized that and became the vehicle for the managerial class, the laptop class, the campuses, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, with only a couple of exceptions, without bringing the workers with them. The Republicans saw an opportunity, as they did in the late 60s, 70s, to capitalize on this and to learn a language, to learn the vocabulary of the working class. So that switcheroony is an extraordinary thing in American politics. And that, I think, in 100 years' time is what Trump will be primarily remembered for. The second part of your question is how does this apply to Australia? Well, I think if we looked at Robert Menzies, who towers over every American president in terms of his experience of winning elections.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. Is it 10 elections he wins?
7.
7, but you can count his winning Kooyong as well. I mean, as a competitive election winner, he is just extraordinary. But what I think you might compare Menzies with Trump in this respect, and I'm sorry if this sounds forced, that Menzies in the 1950s, the 1955 election, for example, he proves what Trump has proved, that winning elections changes the nature of your opponents. So what happens in and after that election in Australia is he forces a split in the ideological complexion of his opponents, the Labour Party. He actually makes them move away from their communist sympathies. So they become much more ideologically commonsensical. And that puts them on the path. It takes them a little while longer, but makes them a much more electable proposition, although it takes until, 1972 for them to get over that line. I think Trump is similar in that he is also, even though Democrats in their moment of deepest grief, i.e. this week, will have to accept that if you're going to beat Trump, you're going to have to change and appeal to his voters in a way that starts to move them away from the Republican Party. And I think that change is going to be moving away from the notion of progressive rights, race and gender, all these things which are in another debate, and then on a university campus, there may be an entirely appropriate place to have this debate. When presenting your credentials to a huge electorate in the United States and having that record of abandoning working class concerns over wokish concerns, I mean, that phrase is that the Democrats stopped being the party of workers and became the party of wokers. It's a caricature, but it captures a certain truth. To realize electoral advantage, and that's why parties exist, to win elections, they're going to have to step back from the more extreme ideological positions, cultural positions they've taken. And I think there's some analog there to how the Labour Party responded to the obvious the strength of the Menzies electoral machine.
Do you think that the fall of communism at the end of the Cold War, the late 80s, early 90s, was that a contributing factor to the changing nature of the modern left-wing movement? So obviously, parties like the Democratic Party, the British Labour Party, the Australian Labour Party. How did that impact?
Yeah. Oh, I think that's fundamental.
Yeah.
And not just because it was the seminal event of my life, lots of ways. I remember the Berlin Wall came down in the second month of my undergraduate career, and we sat around drinking blue Smirnoff, thinking how ironic it was. The only thing Russia could do well was make vodka. And then it transpired that actually blue Smirnoff has not been made in Russia for 70 years. It's moved to the US.
Facts.
But the question you ask, I think, is one that we haven't escaped. At the end of the Cold War taught the right that on economics, they were preeminent. They'll win. The world likes free trade. It likes capitalism, likes stuff. The culture will eventually follow. Whereas the left, and I think they played a much cannier game, decided, right, we've lost the economic argument because all our champions have collapsed, and the one that didn't, communist China, is very quickly moving into a capitalist future, or certainly playing by rules set by the capitalists, or exploiting them. We can only win if we shift the focus to culture. And the right didn't watch this, or watched it thinking it would peter out, and the left took cultural dominion seriously. It doesn't mean they sat around in a small Politburo and said, right, we're gonna take over every university and every school curricula. But that was the practical effect. They decided to their moral superiority would find expression in a whole range of other political claims relating to particularly to race and gender. And the right, conservatives, have only very recently started to play that game. And it's given us, I think, a form of politics in the West, and I think both Australia and the US are good examples of this, where the right knows it can win the political argument, but can't control the culture. And the left is the opposite. The left controls the culture, but can't maintain political preeminence. And that creates huge fissures and tensions across both sides and within them.
So you've written about this sort of idea of peak woke, which, is worth, I guess, unpacking. Is this that moment then?
Yes. Well, I think it's a rhetorical device more than it's an analytical tool or prediction. But yes, I think this. So the next pitch for peak woke would have to be the election we've just seen in the US, where, although it's true that Kamala Harris, I mean, she's not foolish. She didn't run on the trans issue, for example. She very, I think, appropriately, cleverly even, although not to much electoral effect, didn't big up race and gender. The fact she was the first woman of color to run, which is an extraordinary achievement in lots of ways, certainly in identity politics terms. She ran, I think belatedly, as a working class, we'll solve the problem, the economy's getting better, we'll look after you. But the problem is her whole career has been pulling the strings within the woke political dynamics of the California Democratic Party. Hard to escape that legacy, and very easy for the Republicans to exploit it. So they were able to say, you're not just poorer, 20% poorer in terms of spending power, you're also being led by an administration that treats you with contempt, that imposes all sorts of speech codes and moral obligations on you without the attendant economic return. It was a really bad message for Democrats. Didn't have a good counter to that particular message, and the Republicans exploited it. I
thought she was let down too by a lot of her proxies. So, was it Beyonce or someone was calling her
yes.
Oh no, it was Drew Barrymore was calling her the marmala.
Yes.
She was going to be the mum of America, or mom of America.
That's good.
And then someone else was saying, well, don't tell your husband if you're going to vote.
Wasn't that? That was
for
peak
Harris. While Harris herself wasn't saying that, her proxies were. And I think she was really undermined by that.
Very, very, very good point.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to disguise the totality. I mean, woke is overused, but it's also, we should deal with it. The extent to which progressive politics has become, the legitimacy within it is how far you espouse these particular concerns. And the tipping point, it was in my household. Let me use my lived experience of last Wednesday.
And you're married to an American.
Well, I'm married to Heather, who is I suppose she'd describe herself as a swing voter. I mean, leans Republican, socially conservative, pro-life, but cannot stand Donald Trump. Will not vote for Donald Trump. So it's not that she was hunting for an alternative, but if she ever had a notion of voting Democratic, it was ended at that awful, condescending, infantilizing Julia Roberts ad, where they tried to create this illusion that the big brawny MAGA husband was pressuring the wife to vote for him, and these two women wink at each other over the ballot box. We'll really vote an anti-abortion line, and no one will know. It's a secret ballot. If that's how Democrats are treating women, and how they're trying to win the woman's vote, the female vote. That is peak woke.
We have a lot of content to get through here, and there's 5 minutes left of our discussion. I would say to our audience, please keep sending through questions. I can see you've already sent a lot of questions, so Tim and I are going to have to go through these in rapid fire once we start. But final couple of questions from me before we go into the audience Q&A. Apparently, yeah, so you obviously lecture here at the University of Melbourne, and apparently you frequently set the essay question for your students. Donald Trump has the most successful foreign policy record of any president since the end of the Cold War. Discuss. I mean, what's your view?
Well,
answer your own essay.
Yes, well,
your essay question.
And of course, it's asked in order to provoke,
of course,
a set of responses from students who tend to hear only a kind of innovating anti-Trump line, saying there's not a place for that. Although I don't think there's a place for any innovation anywhere on a university campus. But it does pose a very simple question, that if your measure of foreign policy success is the absence of declaring war on another nation and invading that nation, well, Trump's foreign policy is a success. I'd ask you, Georgina, and our listeners to consider in the 20 years prior to Trump's election in 2016, America was invading a country about every 2 years. So it starts in Kuwait at the end of the Cold War. Then you have Bosnia and Kosovo, and then the disaster of the Iraq War and the Afghan War, the Libyan kind of half-hearted intervention from behind. And the result was catastrophic in terms of American lives, particularly the brave men, and they mostly were men, that were killed, numbering now in their thousands. The treasure they expended fighting these wars, which they eventually ran away from. These are the catastrophes American politics has had to live through in the pre-Trump age. Trump delivered. It's not a guarantee of what will happen over the next 4, but in his 4 years, a period of relative repose where he wanted to bring American military force home, where he wanted other actors like the Germans and the British and the French to step up and spend more on their own defense. And there was no great crisis that happened under his watch. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine happens a year plus after Trump leaves office. The Hamas pogrom in Israel, again, he leaves Israel in a moment of what seems like permanent security through the Abraham Accords, and the penetration of the region by Iran seems to have been held in check. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way to answer that question, but the fact of peace under Trump, although it depended on a bit of luck, surely elevates his foreign policy to one which is approaching successful when you compare it to the disasters that preceded it.
And succeeded it. I mean,
yes,
in terms of Biden's foreign
yes.
policy record, I mean, you've talked about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, so failed to deter Russia. You've talked about the Hamas attack on Israel from Gaza, so failed to deter Iran and its proxy Hamas. And, of course, the terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan, relinquishing Afghanistan to the Taliban once again. I mean, all those years of blood and treasure spent on Afghanistan and improving the situation for women there, just lost in a moment. I mean, is Biden going to, do you think, go down as one of the worst foreign policy US presidents?
Well, it's hard in the moment to be overwhelmingly positive about his record. So I think Afghanistan was a terrible stain. Even though Trump is the first guy that does the deal, the guy that carries the can is Biden for the botched withdrawal that follows from it. I don't see where America's relative position vis-a-vis its opponents has actually improved under Biden. It's not a guarantee or a robust defense that it only did that under Trump. But America's position, even though its economy has slowly started to turn around, vis-a-vis its opponents, I think is weaker now than it was under Trump. And that's because of deliberate policies that Biden pursued. The big one, and I'll stop, and it's hard to evaluate clearly what the consequence is, but the running away, the skedaddling out of Afghanistan was watched in the Kremlin, and it was surely watched in Beijing. This is what the US does when it's faced with a really persistent but quite crude and poorly equipped opponent like the Taliban. Why don't we test it? Now, Putin took that one further and actually did test it by invading Ukraine. But I wonder whether Biden foreign policy actually hasn't made Taiwan look more attractive to Xi Jinping than Trump ever did.
Yeah, I think that's a very live question. Look, we are now at 3:31, so I've got to stay committed to the audience participation part of the webinar today, Tim. But first question, so we're getting a lot of questions about the tariffs and the economy, which is great. Do you think Trump will go ahead on his promises regarding tariffs, and what would that mean for the working class voters? I guess
this is
economic conditions.
It seems the obvious question to ask when we're breaking down what might come under his foreign policy. Well, I think that Trump has an ability to talk rhetorically very tough on big issues which earn him support. The wall, obviously, 8 years ago, and being tough on immigration in this campaign, and the forced deportation of something like 10 million illegal immigrants. He has a record of talking tough and then not having the policy skill or interest to actually follow through. And I wonder when we get to the tariff question, which is a tax by any other name, and a tax that will be paid most obviously by some of his supporters, who will find all the stuff they like buying for China is going to cost 10% more, whatever the tariff rate is. I think he has the capacity to actually walk away from that position. If he doesn't, and I don't want to look at Trump through rose-tinted spectacles, but I can the Australian government would be able to say, can we be exempt from this? And a clever government will be able to pull that off. So let's see where tariffs take him. I think tariffs won him a part of the economic nationalism argument in which the campaign was framed. But I'm skeptical that he will find many experts that force him to deliver on it. And he also just lacks the temperament for the fine-grained policy detail to make tariffs work.
But is there an element of you say feel supportive of Trump, but you're opposed to tariffs. So you're hoping that even though he says tariff is his favorite word in the dictionary, and he's talked about tariffs all the way through the last 2 years, basically, why would he turn around and say, "Oh, actually, not so interested in that"?
Well, why did he do it with the wall, Georgina? I suppose is the question. The wall was so central to his campaign in 2016, and it's just. He builds a few 100 miles. Does it reach 1,000 miles? And people now joke that he left gaps in it in order to force the illegal immigrants back through them. But he is not. The Democrats are ideological, and they think in ideological categories, which is why they've never quite found a way of countering Trump. Trump does not think ideologically. He thinks quite short term. He thinks about himself. He relies on kind of gut instinct, which is taken him from insignificance to being a 2-term president.
Yeah.
But it's through, I think, a pragmatism married to an instinctive approach. And so it wouldn't surprise me if he walks away from tariffs, if he walks away from mass deportation. I think there will be some measure, some activity on both counts, but it won't define the next 4 years.
Another question from our audience, Tim, and if you're watching, please do use the Q&A function. We're getting lots of questions through, but it's great to see more, and I can pick and choose my favourite ones, of course. I get moderators' right of choice there. The mainstream media often criticise these days, but, as a I guess users of the newspapers, you're a columnist yourself, often on the radio and TV, you're part of that mainstream media commentary. how relevant is it these days to political elections in the US and Australia? And I guess also the question asked here about the use of podcasts, which seem to be subverting the mainstream media and its utility in campaigns.
Yes, the rationale for that question is a really strong one. That I think the legacy media, particularly, wants to believe its influence is as pervasive as it was 50 years ago, even 10 years ago. And you'll recall how the Washington Post just had this terrible readers. Some of the board members and columnists had a hissy fit when they refused to pick a side. But the question would be, how far does whether the Washington Post or the New York Times or the LA Times picking a side actually materially affect the election result? And I would suggest year on year, the influence of the legacy media is much less. Where the question gets it right, I think, is that the key figure, arguably, after the candidates and after Elon Musk would be Joe Rogan. And I can't recall, and I'm sure it's not happened, where both candidates had the opportunity, and their vice presidential candidates had the opportunity, only taken by the Republican ticket, to sit down for 3 hours and chit-chat and philosophize and reminisce and talk about ultimate fighting and to talk about space exploration, whatever else was covered, as a way of going directly into the earpods of their voters. And Trump was a master of this new media. I mean, he famously doesn't read. And I think his campaigning success has been visual, and with Rogan, both visual and auditory. And the Democrats, with their legacy media and control of the big presses, just never got close to matching. So yes, I think podcasts have been the revelation of this campaign. I can't recall exploiting podcasts quite as much and using both left-leaning, right-leaning, and centrist ones to help understand what's going on. I'll never not read, but you can now become very electorally savvy and literate, ironically, without actually reading New York Times editorials.
Another really interesting question from the audience today, Tim, and just a reminder: use the Q&A function, send your questions through. So in Australia, 44% of respondents to a question about the US election say they now want to have closer relations with China because they don't like a US led by President Trump. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, I think there is
a
kind of Australian version of Trump derangement syndrome. The Trump, whether you think he's the devil, is a democratically elected leader of a very important Western democracy. The idea that means because you don't like the individual that's going to be in office for the next 4 years, you're going to jump into bed with communist China, that offers some alternative, more moral alternative, I just think is that really is crazy. I think it's entirely fine. It's a competitive system in the United States where you're allowed to dislike and love the candidates that it throws up. But the idea that Australian foreign policy or Australian interests should spin on the turn of the US electoral cycle on whoever sits in the Oval Office, I think it's ahistorical. Australia has long-term interests that it basically gets most administrations to recognize and to work with, and Trump will be no exception.
Another question from the audience on a policy issue. Will Trump end climate change and net zero, given he's saying he will once again withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement and apparently the World Health Organization, the United Nations? I mean, what won't he withdraw the US from?
He's not designed as a kind of international community candidate, is he?
No.
He's not
a multilateralist.
He's not a Greta Thunberg hero. And in part of his whole persona is to run against these international elites who he claims have manufactured a climate crisis. I think the response here is that, no, you won't get all the symbolic gestures that we've seen from any number of democratic administrations on behalf of climate change. But you might, and this might maybe me being too optimistic, see an American president that takes alternative energy sources more seriously. And this obviously leads us to the question we are confronting slowly and reluctantly, to embrace, whether we embrace nuclear power. I think Trump is probably good, is a good thing in terms of stirring up that debate. So this consensus we seem to have ended on, that wind power and wave power are the solution, is likely to become less and less acceptable. So I'm trying to find reasons to be cheerful if you're concerned about climate. And it could be that Trump throws so many things into the air, we get a now proper debate about how America, the world's chief emitter, fuels itself. And Trump probably is a guy to unlock and cause that debate more than Biden was.
Another question from the audience. So, Real Clear Politics has the Republicans winning only one more seat in the House. We'll see how it all falls out, but that seems to be the current expectation. Why a weaker showing in the House for the Republicans than obviously the presidential election, where he, for first time since I think the end of the Cold War, got a plurality of the vote?
Yes, well, there may be some evidence for, although the evidence gets less convincing, that there is some split ticket voting. So Americans, certainly until this century, had a preference for voting one party for president, another party for Senate.
A sort of keep the bastards honest type.
Yes,
yeah.
And what they want is a president that is powerful, of course, but checked. And it may be that because the House represents the closest connection to the people voting for their representative tend to have local issues front and center. They're not thinking in terms of grand national visions or the progressive positions that Kamala Harris campaigned on. So it gave them more freedom to actually think about local concerns. And that's why Democrats actually may have done slightly better. We'll have to see how it finally shakes out. But Democrats, they're not done for if they can reconnect with ordinary voters and find a vocabulary for ordinary voter concerns, which the House of Representatives is actually pretty good at channeling, maybe a good model for them to ponder. Then their chances of clawing back national power become greater. So it's a long response to a good question, but in 22, again, I was wrong, like many others. But in 22, the midterms didn't produce the red wave that was predicted. Bit of a red trickle.
Red herring?
Something of a red herring, without over-exploiting the metaphor. But what 22 told Democrats was it was just one more heave and they'd have Trump out. And it wasn't. The red trickle actually presaged the red wave. It was the first intimations of this not quite a tsunami, but this huge red wave which has overwhelmed the Democrats. And that there may have been intimations of that in how Congress, how people voted for Congress in that year.
Another question from the audience about how the Trump administration is going to fulfill all the promises and policy announcements they made. So if they've got the presidency, the House and the Senate, what stops them?
Well, history stops them, I think, Georgina.
Yeah.
And the two good examples here would be you're not guaranteed, if you control, the same party controls the White House and Congress, for that party to dominate politics. And the best example of this is 1994. It's a reverse example. Bill Clinton, for the first 2 years of but nobody remembers Bill Clinton now. He must be looking at where the Democrats have got to and just wonder how this happened. A guy that was blue collar to his core and knew that language. And it was Kamala Harris that carried the flag. I think he and then Obama viewed her with great skepticism. But anyway, in 92 he wins on only 43% of the vote, but he has a Democratic Congress. But he finds those first 2 years some of the hardest in terms of establishing legislation, in part because Congress starts to assert its institutional identity. The best thing that happens to Bill Clinton is defeat in 1994, and you get the first Republican Congress in 40 years, and suddenly Bill Clinton has a foil. He has an opponent to define himself against. Trump's problem is he's now got, not unlike Clinton when Clinton gets in the first term, he's now got an institution which potentially is Republican majority in both, which is now full of men and women eager to define themselves, not against him, but to create their own celebrity, to create possibly problems for a lame duck administration, because he is a lame duck, and men and women who will be jostling to replace him. The Senate has become the great engine for presidents. It gave us Obama, it gave us Biden, it almost gave us, or not quite almost, but could have given us Kamala Harris. And we could see the Senate become a kind of fertile soil for the challenges to Trump that will come from the Republican Party.
Someone's asked a question about the role the Teamsters and other unions had in this election. They were not endorsing Harris and were part. Some of them, Teamsters, were part of campaign activities for the Trump campaign. So, I mean, was that a definitive move?
Well, I don't think
from the union movement.
I don't think definitive, but I think symbolically, the illustrative effect of that, I think, is very powerful. That the Teamsters are like trade unions across the United States, have been hit by the defenestration of the industrial working class by free trade and globalization. And the Democrats had no way of really recognizing this until it was too late. It's a very good marker, I think, for how they've fallen. They were the party that represented the blue collar, the natural territory for the Teamsters. The fact that Donald Trump was able to become the new champion for American trade unions is indicative of the challenge that now confronts the Democrats. All the while, the Democrats, of course, thought, well, perhaps we don't need the trade unions as much because we've got the campuses and we have Hollywood, and we have Silicon Valley and the managerial elite. And that's proven to be bogus. That managerial elite has, I think, in some ways helped frame the very woke agenda, which has caused the Democrats so many problems this year. And the Teamsters, who, if nothing else, like any good trade union movement, are able to recognize where real power lies and how to get their interests represented. And that was Trump. It wasn't Harris. And
I mean, the trouble with the managerial elite is there's actually not enough of them in the end to go to a ballot box and change the course of an election, whereas the everyday working people do change the course of an election.
Yes, I absolutely think so. And that managerial elite could get an Obama over the line twice. What you can't do is, in a period of sustained inflation, after a generation of almost deflation, you can't expect this laptop class and its preoccupations to carry the day when people can't afford bacon. People don't give priority to all these woke concerns because they can't afford milk. And to poo-poo that, for progressives to say, well, you're thinking narrowly about your own selfish self-interest, that's what most people do. And they don't have the insulation of a job where they can sit back and look at a computer screen. If you're making stuff, doing stuff, building stuff, and you can't afford your mortgage, and then you're threatened with these jobs moving south and west, you can see where Trump's appeal starts to become very persuasive.
So, Tim, we're in the final 10 minutes of our Afternoon Light Live, and I've got a lot of questions to go through here. So I'll go to the next one from the audience. And you've talked about the new age of conservatism. This is the age of Trump, but it's going to be the age of Vance potentially, because he is really the next gen. He's just 40. Even younger than me, Tim, even younger than me. But what is the future then of the non-Trump Republicans, the never Trumpers? I think they were known the last time.
It's an intriguing question. Yeah, so the problem for never Trumpers is captured in the person of Liz Cheney. Spent several months in Wyoming last year, 22 into 23, where she was the devil. This is the reddest state, and maintained that title last week. The reddest state in the union. It's the only state which went 70 plus for Trump.
Right.
Nowhere else got close to that.
Although I noticed DC was 90 for Harris.
Terms the other way, yes.
Like a North Korea kind of electoral outcome.
It is. I spent much of that year not quite commuting between DC and Wyoming, but I made that trip a couple of times, and it was extraordinary to think you're going from one entirely different version of political America to another. But Liz Cheney, I think, if she represents the Never Trumpers, they're on a hiding to nothing, because if anything, her reputation amongst even commonsensical Republicans took a hit when she shared the stage with what turned out to be the catastrophic candidate Kamala Harris. So Never Trumpers have now got 4 years, and let me suggest they can't spend those 4 years waiting for Trump to die or be impeached. They've got to find a way of being part of the reformation of conservative politics. Now, this may be the delusions of somebody who's trying to be optimistic on behalf of ideological competition. I rather like the fact the United States has extremes of left and right. I think it creates appropriate competition. They find good solutions in the middle, at least in theory they do. What you have on the Republican side now, and it's captured in contrast to Liz Cheney, is J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is young, he's clever, he has a non-traditional Republican story. He came through the dislocation caused by progressive welfarism and this cultural decline, and has come up with solutions to solving it. He experienced firsthand the addiction epidemic in a way that many Democrats just haven't and don't. And he represents a more technocratic understanding of where conservatism can go. This is a very neat theory, but let me suggest very quickly, if the left have spent the last 50 years marching through the institutions, every institution, public institution that we encounter, from schools to universities to governments, leans left, is progressive, flies the rainbow flags. His solution is not to shout at this from the sidelines, but actually come up with, plot a technocratic response where conservatives march back in and through those institutions. This is a generational project, and Vance may lack, through age and the attractions of fame, not be able to pull off. But I think he does represent a much more cogent response to the culture war that Republicans for too long have simply been reactionary about, rather than coming up with plans for how to change it, how to win it.
Given a lot of the Trump agenda is less what we would say in Australia conservative. I mean, it's branded conservative, but a lot of it is populist, it challenges, I think, well, obviously the Never Trump Republicans, it challenges their beliefs, their ideological beliefs. Do you think that the sort of left-right ideological divide works anymore, or is this just a moment in time where we're just getting a recalibration? I mean, in Australian history, you do see the rise and fall of right and left-wing populism, and it does influence the major parties, but there's, tends to be a kind of a settling down of that and a return to the normal kind of left-right divide. But I mean, what is this sort of moment where Trump really challenges a lot of traditional conservatism and a traditional Republican, capital R Republican values? Well,
it's an excellent question. I think Trump does represent, if not a realignment, a reassessment of what conservatism actually means, in part because he just doesn't use these labels. No. He has no ideological framing for these things. He spent much of his life as a registered and donating Democrat. And I think the move of the working class into the Republican camp starts to really query the idea that there's of this spectrum. If anything, there may be a the horseshoe, where both populists, there are populists towards the end of this horseshoe on both sides, and they are competing for a common electorate, and this managerial laptop class is somewhere higher up the horseshoe. Menzies, and you're a greater expert than me when it comes to Australia's longest serving prime minister, but very explicitly when he creates a Liberal Party, he does not create a Conservative Party.
No.
I mean, and I think it's his greatest contribution, I think, to political theory. It's the idea that Conservatives represent the best of a liberal tradition rather than simply being reactionary to an emerging left-wing agenda. But it's a different vocabulary they have in the US. And I think even with our problematic history of race, the question of race particularly, which caused the last great realignment, is still one that they are working with, and makes the easy left-right spectrum increasingly redundant.
Another question from the audience, and I guess linked to the left-right challenge, is on the question of abortion. I mean, very much a big issue in the United States, a lower order issue in Australia, although it's became an issue during the Queensland state election the other day. The Latino vote was traditionally seen as the purview of the Democratic Party, less so now. Trump's managed to attract a lot of the Latino vote, particularly the male Latino vote. So the sort of Hispanics who have a Catholic tradition,
yes.
Do you think they were impacted by the pro-life, pro-choice debate in the United States?
Yes. I think abortion, and we need at least another hour and longer to be able to unpack that one. But I think abortion had less of an electoral impact than the Harris campaign needed it to. This was clearly a campaign fought on the bread and butter issues. So when we talk about why Trump, it's not that he suddenly started to appeal to Hispanics, but if you looked at Mitt Romney in 2012, he was commanding about 27% of the Hispanic support. Trump has now taken that to 45. He has revealed that Hispanic voters are a competitive group, which both sides have to calibrate their message.
And this is all the while wanting to clamp down on illegal immigration. And,
yes. Well, isn't that the extraordinary thing? That this rather hackneyed progressive assumption that there is something inherently that race leads to solidarity has been blown apart by this election, that some of these Hispanic voters have been the most anti-illegal immigration. They are the products of legal immigration. America is made by successive intakes of legal immigrants. But there was no racial solidarity that the Democrats could use to offset the disaster of 10 million illegals coming in under the Biden administration. What Trump has been able to do well, I think, is to say, even though he may play fast and loose with some of these moral concerns, faith and family matter to a huge majority of Hispanic voters who remain one of the most religious demographics in the United States. Trump, who I imagine has not read much of the Bible, but he knows the power of Christianity and the connection of that to traditional values like family. He was able to say, you can have these cultural concerns addressed, and we will deal with the economic crisis, and we will deal with immigration. Again, it's been part of our subtext in our discussion, Georgina, this afternoon. The Democrats had no persuasive way of resisting that, beyond saying, well, no, our identity politics tell us that if a white man is running against a person of color, every other person of color, black, brown, and everything else, must vote for her. And those people of color, I think very importantly, told her to get lost.
Well, perhaps their identity wasn't the major issue for the person, the individual, the voter.
I think that's what the Democrats need to, I think, try and reconcile. Identity really has a limit in terms of translating it into political power.
Professor Tim Lynch, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light today. It's been a rollicking good ride discussing the US presidential election and, of course, the impacts it'll have on Australia too. Perhaps the topic for yet another Afternoon Light Live one day. Thank you to our wonderful audience and all your fantastic questions. This this will be up on our YouTube channel shortly, I hope. And I really appreciate you joining us for Afternoon Light Live.
It's been a very great pleasure. Thank you.